For this portion of our online work, we're going to take a look at the criteria of an accomplished learning target. So we'll go through each of these criteria that you see in the rubric and think about what does this mean in terms of developing a quality learning target. At the end of this, you will be able to write 1 or 2 learning targets that do meet this criteria on the discussion board below, and then give feedback to 2 of your colleagues, at least 2 of your colleagues, using the language of this rubric as they crafted their learning targets. So let's take a look at this different criteria. The first criteria is standards-based and rigorous. So we want to be sure that our learning targets are grounded in standards and that they are based in the standards. We also want to ask ourselves, is the target rigorous? And I think it's important to note that rigor isn't that we're asking ourselves if the target is difficult, but rather we're asking, does the target demand the kind of thinking that's required of the standard? Is it aligned? Is it aligned in terms of thinking? And that's why you see here an accomplished learning target is derived from national or state standards and school or district documents such as curriculum maps or program materials, and that targets fall across multiple categories in a cognitive rigor matrix. A cognitive rigor matrix is looking at Bloom's taxonomy or Webb's depth of knowledge. But what you want to ask yourself around the learning target you write is, does that target line up with the kind of thinking that's demanded by the standard? Our second criteria is student-friendly. We talked in the purpose of learning targets about targets are to invite the students into the learning, they're to communicate the learning, they're to help us set a purpose for the learning. Well, we can't do that unless we write our targets in a way that are student-friendly, that can be accessed by the student. What I caution you here with student-friendly is that you want to make them student-friendly, but you also want to think about, you don't want to make them so, you don't want to use language that's condescending, let's say. So for example, there's a kindergarten math standard that is asking students to be able to decompose their numbers 1 through 10. When we write a learning target around that standard, it might be easy for us to think, oh, we need to switch the word decompose. I can decompose my numbers 1 through 10 isn't really student-friendly for a kindergartner. But yet, the word decompose is an important word, and we want them to be able to use that word, and that is what we want them to be able to do. I can decompose my numbers 1 through 10 and really understand what decomposition means. So sometimes we need to think about the vocabulary words that we use so that we can use appropriate language to help communicate those standards and also use that target to help teach some of that vocabulary. So while we want them to be student-friendly, we just need to be careful that we don't make them so simple that we lose what that standard is asking students to consider. Our third criteria is measurability. And again, so measurability is, can you measure that learning target? Can you measure whether or not students have met that target? And when we look at the accomplished language of our rubric, it says they're measurable and use concrete, accessible verbs. The verbs suggest the way that the target will be assessed. For example, analyze suggests a writing or problem-solving assessment, not a multiple-choice quiz. So being able to match up those verbs with the kind of assessment tool you would use to measure your target. What I caution you also here with measurability is that you don't think about writing learning targets that are so measurable that they become almost silly. So in other words, sometimes we need, because of the way the standards are written, we need to go after learning targets that might be messy, that might not feel like they're easily measured. They might not fit into a multiple choice test. But that's okay. If the standard is asking for that kind of thinking, then we want to start thinking about how do we measure that? How do we measure the ability to perform? How do we measure the ability to perform a variety of complex skills as we saw in our phys ed standard in the first topic? So when you think about measurability, first think about what the standards are asking when you write that target, and then let's consider how do we begin to measure student progress toward that target. So we have standards-based and rigorous, student-friendly and measurable. Our fourth criteria is specific and contextualized. And what this is asking us to consider when we write learning targets, that we make them specific to the lesson or to the learning that's happening at that point in time. That's what will help us have that focus for the learning and set that purpose and intention for the learning. So they might refer to a specific context of the lesson. And what we have to do is be careful not to write learning targets that are so general they no longer become helpful. For example, I can read. Okay, I can read. I know I'm going to be working on that throughout the year. But perhaps for a learning target for a lesson would be, I can read this article about body mass index and make sense of it using the discussion techniques of today. So in other words, we have to make that learning target specific and contextualized so it can become helpful in the lesson and the learning that's happening. And our last criteria is learning-centered. And learning-centered really is asking us to make sure the target is grounded in the learning, not in the task. An example of that might be, I can design a poster to demonstrate the habitat of a polar bear. But rather write it as, I can articulate my understanding of the habitat of the polar bear in poster format, or I can demonstrate my understanding of a polar bear's habitat using a poster. The second one is grounded in the learning around the habitat of a polar bear, the first in the task of completing a poster. So when you write your learning target, you want to be sure that you're writing it where the focus is on the learning, not on the task that's being done. With these criteria in mind, I'm going to ask now that you take a look at your standards and write 1 or 2 learning targets that would meet this criteria and post them in the discussion board below. And then take a look at least 2 of your colleagues' learning targets and give them feedback using the language of this rubric so that we can begin to refine these learning targets as we move forward.